At the family dinner, my parents ordered, "You have 2 days to get your stuff out." But my name is Samantha Hayes. I'm 31 years old, and I'm a nurse here in Oregon. For most of my life, I believed that if you worked hard and did the right thing, especially for your family, you would be valued. I thought sacrifice earned you a place at the table, but I was wrong. The story I'm about to tell you is about the night that illusion shattered into a million pieces. It's about how the people who were supposed to love me most tried to erase me. Before we dive in like this video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comment, where in the world are you watching from? It started at a family dinner, one of those Sunday meals that was supposed to feel warm but always felt cold. The air in our dining room was thick with things no one was saying. My mom, Sarah, was moving mashed potatoes around her plate, creating little mountains and valleys. My younger brother, Ryan, was leaning back in his chair, scrolling on his phone with a lazy, entitled smile. And my dad, Tom, was staring at the table with a kind of simmering anger that had become his default expression. I was just trying to get through the meal without a fight. I kept my head down, cutting my chicken into small, careful pieces. The silence was heavy, broken only by the scrape of forks on plates. I could feel the tension like a physical weight on my shoulders. Something was coming. I knew it in the same way you know a storm is coming before the first drop of rain falls. Then it happened. My father slammed his water glass down on the oak table. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. My mother flinched. Ryan didn't even look up from his phone. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. My dad's eyes, when they met mine, were as cold and hard as stone. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. He delivered the line with a chilling flatness, as if he were ordering a coffee. "You have 2 days to pack your things and leave," he said. The words hung in the air, sharp and unbelievable. I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. It felt like a line from a movie, not something my own father would ever say to me. Not after everything. He wasn't finished. He gestured with his chin toward my brother, who finally looked up with a smug glint in his eye. "This house belongs to your brother now." The world stopped. The quiet that followed was worse than the sound of the glass slamming down. It was a vacuum sucking all the air out of my lungs. I looked at my mother, searching for help, for some sign that this was a horrible joke. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She just kept staring at her plate, pushing those potatoes around, a silent accomplice to my execution. Ryan just smirked. A small, triumphant curl of his lip. Humiliation washed over me, hot and sickening. I was sitting in a chair I had bought, at a table I had refinished, in a house I had saved, and I was being discarded like a piece of trash. The betrayal wasn't just in the words. It was in their faces, in their silence. They had all agreed on this before I even sat down to eat. I wasn't family. I was just an obstacle to be removed. The memory of that dinner, my father's cold pronouncement, my mother's silent complicity, my brother's triumphant smirk, is a scar, but the wound itself is much older. To understand the betrayal, you have to go back 3 years, to the moment I chose to become their savior. The choice was made on a Tuesday night in October, after a 14-hour shift that had stripped me down to raw nerve endings. I remember the drive home from the hospital felt like swimming through molasses. The streetlights smeared across my windshield. The radio was just white noise, and my bones ached with a fatigue so deep it felt cellular. It was a bad shift. A car accident had brought in a family of 4, and the frantic, high-stakes energy of the ER had been followed by the somber, hollowed-out quiet of loss. I had spent the last hour holding the hand of a woman who had just become a widow, her soft, disbelieving sobs echoing in the sterile little waiting room. My own grief, a secondhand sorrow, clung to me like the antiseptic smell of the hospital. All I wanted was a hot shower and the oblivion of sleep. The moment I opened the front door, however, I knew something was wrong. The house was too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but a dead, heavy quiet, like the air after a lightning strike. The lights were low, and a strange metallic scent of fear hung in the air. I found my parents in the kitchen, sitting at the table under the dim light of the fixture I'd installed myself. They weren't speaking. My mother, Sarah, was staring at her hands, which were folded so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy. My father, Tom, a man whose posture had always been ramrod straight with pride, was slumped in his chair, staring at a stack of envelopes on the table as if they were a coiled snake. He looked smaller, older, utterly defeated. "Mom? Dad?" My voice sounded loud in the stillness. My mother looked up and her face crumpled. A fresh wave of tears spilled down her cheeks. My father didn't move, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "What's wrong?" I asked, dropping my bag by the door and walking toward them. My mind raced through a list of horrible possibilities. Had someone died? Was someone sick? My father finally lifted his gaze from the envelopes to me, and his eyes were hollow. "We're losing the house, Sammy," he said, his voice a rough, broken whisper. I looked at the table. The envelopes were from the bank. I saw the bold, angry red letters, final notice, past due, and the one that made my blood run cold, foreclosure warning. It turned out the foundation of our lives was built on sand. My dad had lost his job at the lumber mill nearly a year before, a fact he'd hidden from me with vague stories about reduced hours. He had tried to make up for it with a series of disastrously bad investments, pouring their modest savings into schemes pitched by a man he knew from the local bar. He'd been chasing a big win that would solve everything, but instead, he'd dug a hole so deep we were all about to be buried in it. They were $75,000 in debt. The mortgage hadn't been paid in 6 months, and the bank, having exhausted its patience, was days away from seizing the property. As he explained it all in a halting, shame-filled monotone, my mother just sat there weeping silently. The story was a litany of pride, foolishness, and fear. They hadn't told me because they were ashamed. They hadn't asked for help because they thought they could fix it. Now it was broken beyond their repair. Ryan, of course, was a ghost in this conversation. He was in California, a world away, living a life funded by dreams, and, I now realized, the last dregs of our parents' credit. The burden, as it always did, was settling right here, in this quiet, desperate kitchen. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my childhood bed, listening to the old house groan around me. Through the thin walls, I could hear the muffled sounds of my mother's crying, a sound that seemed to seep into the very plaster. I pulled up my banking app on my phone, the screen glowing in the dark. The number staring back at me was the sum of my life for the past 5 years. It represented every holiday I'd worked, every double shift I'd picked up, every invitation from friends I'd declined because I was too tired or saving money. I could see the moments that built that number. The night I'd successfully inserted an IV into a dehydrated child on the first try, the grateful smile from his terrified mother, the afternoon I spent cleaning and dressing the wounds of a homeless man who told me I was the first person to show him kindness in a decade, the grueling code blue where we'd brought a man back from the brink of death, the sweat and adrenaline and bone-deep satisfaction of it. That money wasn't just money. It was my exhaustion, my triumphs, my sacrifices. It was my future. It was the down payment on a small condo of my own, a sunny place with a small balcony where I could grow herbs. It was my escape hatch from this house of constant, simmering crises. It was my life, waiting to begin. And now, my parents' failure was threatening to devour it. A bitter, resentful part of me wanted to say no. It wasn't my debt. It wasn't my mistake. Why should my future be the collateral for their pride and my father's bad decisions? I could take my money, find a new apartment, and let them face the consequences. I could walk away, but then I thought of the foreclosure sign being hammered into the front lawn. I thought of my parents in their late 50s, with nothing to their name, having to move into some shabby, run-down apartment. I pictured my mother's garden, the one she'd tended for 30 years, being dug up by strangers. I remembered my father teaching me to ride my bike in the driveway. The house wasn't just wood and nails. It was the backdrop to every memory I had. My resentment warred with my sense of duty, a toxic, churning battle in the pit of my stomach. I was a nurse. My entire being was programmed to fix, to heal, to alleviate suffering. How could I watch my own parents suffer and do nothing? The decision felt less like a choice and more like a surrender. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. The drive to the bank the next morning was silent. My parents sat in my car like two chastened children, the shame radiating off them in waves. I felt less like their daughter and more like a parole officer. Inside the bank, the air was cold and smelled of paper. We were led to a small glass-walled cubicle belonging to a loan officer named Mr. Gable. He was a man with a tired suit and even more tired eyes, and he looked at us with a profound lack of sentimentality. We were just another sad story, another number on his daily ledger. He laid out the mountain of paperwork, explaining the legal jargon in a monotone drone that I barely registered. All I could focus on was the final settlement amount. It would take everything I had, down to the last few $100s. I slid my debit card across the desk, my hand trembling slightly. Mr. Gable processed the payment. I watched on my phone as the number that represented my entire future, my condo, my independence, plummeted into oblivion. The feeling was a physical blow, a punch to the gut that left me breathless. The moment it was done, the relief that washed over my parents was overwhelming. It was as if they could breathe again. In the sterile bank parking lot, my mother pulled me into a hug so fierce it felt desperate. She was sobbing again, but this time the tears were different. "Oh, Sammy," she wept into my hair. "You saved us. You're our savior, our angel." My dad, his eyes red and watery, gripped my arm. "We'll pay you back every penny, honey," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear it. We will make this right. In that moment, their gratitude was so raw, so potent, that it felt real. It soothed the raw, gaping wound in my bank account. I had done the right thing. I had saved my family. The sacrifice, I told myself, would be worth it. But saving the house from the bank was one thing. Saving it from itself was another. The crisis had passed, but the years of neglect remained. My one-time sacrifice quickly morphed into a 3-year sentence of servitude. That winter, the old furnace finally died with a shuddering groan. The repair bill was $2,000 I didn't have, so it went on my credit card. The following spring, a windstorm tore a swath of shingles off the roof, leading to a persistent leak in the attic that stained the ceiling of my old bedroom. Finding a reliable roofer I could afford became my second job. I spent my days off getting quotes, researching materials, and juggling my hospital schedule to meet with contractors. I was no longer just the daughter. I was the household manager, the financier, the general contractor. I learned how to plaster and paint over the water damage myself, watching online tutorials late at night after exhausting shifts. I replaced the sputtering washing machine and the ancient energy-guzzling refrigerator. I bought a new sofa to replace the old one with the broken springs, the one my dad complained about every night. With every repair, every purchase, their gratitude flowed. "What would we do without you, Sammy?" my mom would say, her eyes shining as she admired the new appliance. Her praise was a balm, a temporary anesthetic for the slow bleeding of my own life. I was working constantly, picking up every overtime shift I could, my life shrinking to the narrow corridor between the hospital and the hardware store. My friends stopped calling as much. I was always busy, always tired. The dream of my own condo faded into a distant, impossible fantasy. My reality was this house. I was pouring my youth, my energy, and every dollar I earned into its foundation, shoring it up, making it strong. I believed I was investing in my family, earning my place at its heart. I didn't realize I was just renovating my own prison. The son, in our family, had a name, Ryan. Everything and everyone revolved around him. He was the brilliant one, the charismatic one, the one destined for greatness. My parents had built a mythology around my younger brother so powerful that it was immune to reality. He was their golden boy, and his light was so blinding it cast the rest of us into permanent shadow. I remember the party they threw for him when he left for California. Our small backyard was filled with neighbors and relatives. My dad stood by the grill, flipping burgers and boasting to anyone who would listen about Ryan's move. He was joining a bleeding-edge tech startup that was going to disrupt the entire social media paradigm. The words sounded impressive, rehearsed. My mother floated through the crowd, her face glowing with pride, refilling glasses and accepting congratulations as if Ryan had just cured a disease. They'd spent hundreds of dollars on that party. Money I now realize they probably didn't have. By contrast, my own achievements were met with a polite, almost absent-minded nod. When I graduated from nursing school at the top of my class, my parents took me out for a quiet dinner at a chain restaurant. The main topic of conversation, I recall, was a funny email Ryan had sent them about his new life on the West Coast. When I got my first job at the hospital, my dad patted me on the shoulder and said, "That's nice, honey. Steady work." There was no party. There was no bragging. My success was seen as practical, expected. I was the reliable daughter, the sturdy draft horse. Ryan was the thoroughbred, destined for the winner's circle. Of course, the thoroughbred never quite made it out of the starting gate. The bleeding-edge startup went bust within a year. Ryan, unfazed, moved on to the next grand venture, and the next. Each one was announced with a phone call home full of breathless jargon and buzzwords. AI, blockchain, synergistic platforms. And each one inevitably ended a few months later with a different kind of phone call. I remember one such call vividly. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the kitchen, exhausted after a morning spent cleaning out the gutters. My mom was on the phone with Ryan, her back to me. Her voice was a high-pitched, anxious coo. "Oh, honey, don't you worry. Of course we can help. It's just a temporary cash flow problem, I understand." When she hung up, her face was tight with worry. "Ryan needs a little help," she announced to me and my dad. "The investors are just a little slow this month. He needs $2,000 to cover his rent and expenses." My dad, who had been meticulously tracking every dollar I spent on groceries, just nodded grimly. The boys got to eat. "He's working on big things. It takes money to make money." I just stared at them, the ladder grime still under my fingernails. "He has a job, right?" I asked. My mother's expression soured, her defensive loyalty flaring up. "It's not a job, Samantha. He's an entrepreneur. It's very stressful. You wouldn't understand. They sent him the money." It was a pattern that repeated itself every few months. His potential was a black hole that swallowed their resources, and my contributions were the bedrock that made it all possible. I was the one ensuring the mortgage was paid so they could afford to fund his failures. The irony was a constant bitter taste in my mouth. On social media, Ryan curated an image of a successful tech mogul, photos from trendy co-working spaces, posts about the hustle, musings on innovation. He was performing a life of success, and my parents were his willing and primary audience. Then, 3 months before that final fateful dinner, the performance ended. The golden boy came home. He didn't arrive with fanfare or announcements of a triumphant return. He just showed up on the doorstep one afternoon with 2 expensive-looking suitcases and an aura of sheepish failure he tried to mask with a layer of sarcasm. His final venture, an app that was supposed to connect dog owners with artisanal pet food, had imploded, leaving him broke and in debt. But in my parents' eyes, he wasn't a failure. He was a hero returning from battle, weary and in need of recuperation. The fatted calf was slaughtered. Ryan's home, my mother announced over the phone to relatives, her voice brimming with a joy I hadn't heard in years. He's just taking a little break to recharge. He has so many new ideas. The house, my quiet sanctuary of predictable routines, was instantly thrown into chaos. Ryan's presence filled every room. He slept until noon, emerging from his room with the entitled air of a guest at a 5-star hotel. He left his dirty clothes on the floor, his wet towels on the bathroom doorknob, and his empty bowls on the coffee table in front of the TV he watched for hours on end. He was a 29-year-old tornado of entropy, and I was the one constantly cleaning up in his wake. The dynamic between us was immediately, poisonously clear. He saw me not as his sister or the savior of the family, but as the live-in help. He'd ask, "Hey, are we out of milk?" with the same tone he might use on a waiter. He'd take my car without asking, bringing it back with the gas tank on empty. One Saturday, I was heading out to the grocery store. I had the shopping list I'd prepared, the coupons I'd clipped. As I was grabbing my purse, Ryan walked into the kitchen yawning. "Oh good, you're going out," he said. "Pick me up some of that cold brew coffee I like. And the organic granola. Not the cheap stuff. It wasn't a request. It was an order." Something inside me snapped. "There's a list on the counter of what we need," I said, my voice tight. "If you want something special, you're welcome to go get it yourself. Or you could contribute to the grocery bill." The air went still. Ryan looked at me with genuine surprise, as if the toaster had just spoken to him. Before he could respond, my mother swooped in from the living room, her face a mask of disapproval aimed squarely at me. "Samantha, that's enough," she said sharply. "Your brother has been through a lot. He's under a tremendous amount of pressure, trying to figure out his next move. The last thing he needs is you nagging him about granola." She turned to Ryan, her voice softening into its familiar, adoring coo. "Don't you worry about a thing, sweetheart. I'll add it to the list. You just go relax." I stood there speechless and invisible. In that single exchange, my years of sacrifice were rendered meaningless. My hard-earned money that paid for the food, my time and effort, it was all just a utility. Ryan's comfort, his feelings, his ridiculous whims, that was what mattered. I wasn't a person. I was a resource he was entitled to, and that my parents were more than happy for him to exploit. From that day on, I saw the end game taking shape. I saw the way my parents started whispering with Ryan in the evenings, their heads close together, falling silent whenever I walked into the room. I noticed the way my father started looking at me, not with gratitude, but with a kind of cold calculation. They were huddling, planning, scheming. They had their golden boy back under their roof, and the house I had saved, the home I had rebuilt, was being prepared for his coronation. My presence had become an inconvenience, a loose end that needed to be tied up. The dinner, when it came, wasn't a surprise. It was an execution that had been planned for months. They had just been waiting for the right moment to swing the axe. The walk from the dining room to the stairs felt like wading through deep water. Each step was a monumental effort, my legs heavy and unresponsive. The sounds of the house, the clinking of forks on plates as my family resumed their meal, the low drone of the television from the living room, seemed to be coming from a great distance, distorted and unreal. A strange buzzing silence had enveloped me, the kind you feel in the moments after a car crash or a terrible fall. It was the sound of shock, a buffer my brain had thrown up between me and a reality too sharp to touch. I gripped the banister to pull myself up the stairs. My own hand had sanded and restained this wood 2 years ago. I remembered the feeling of the rough grain smoothing out under my sandpaper, the satisfying ache in my shoulders after a long day of work. I had done it because my mother had complained about the risk of splinters. The gesture, like 1,000 others, had been an act of love, of care. Now, the smooth, cool wood felt alien under my palm, a relic from a life that had just been declared a lie. When I reached my room, I shut the door behind me. The click of the latch was a sound of absolute finality. It was the sound of a cell door closing, of a coffin lid being sealed. I leaned against it, my back pressed against the solid wood, and slid down to the floor. I didn't cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside me, a glacier of grief too immense to melt. I just sat there, wrapped in the suffocating quiet, my arms wrapped around my knees, trying to breathe. My room, once my sanctuary, had transformed into a museum of my own foolishness. Every object was an exhibit, a testament to my misplaced faith. My gaze drifted around the space, cataloging the fruits of my labor. The ceiling, a perfect clean expanse of eggshell white. I remembered the weekend I'd spent on a rickety stepladder, a scarf tied around my hair, my neck aching as I carefully applied 2 coats. My dad had poked his head in once, observed my work for a moment, and said, "Don't drip on the carpet," before disappearing again. At the time, I'd interpreted his comment as gruff approval. Now, I saw it for what it was, the indifferent observation of a landlord watching a tenant make improvements on his property. My eyes fell on the curtains, a soft blue linen I had saved up for months to buy. I had wanted to bring a little color and warmth into the room, to make it feel more like my own. I remembered my mother seeing them for the first time. "Oh, those are lovely, dear," she had said with a pleasant smile. "They really brighten things up." It was the kind of polite compliment you'd give a neighbor, not the warm praise of a mother acknowledging her daughter's effort to make a home. The curtains weren't for us. They were for me, and my space, I now understood, had always been temporary, conditional. I was a long-term guest whose lease was about to expire. I lay on my bed, the bed I'd bought with my first real bonus from the hospital, and stared at the ceiling I had painted. The sheer scale of the deception was beginning to dawn on me, and it was dizzying. They had watched me. For 3 years, they had watched me pour every spare dollar, every ounce of energy into this house. They watched me come home, exhausted from holding lives in my hands, and spend my evenings researching plumbers or patching drywall. They ate the food I bought, enjoyed the warmth from the furnace I'd replaced, and sat on the furniture I'd paid for, all while knowing this was coming. They had accepted my sacrifices with gentle smiles and words of gratitude that were, I now realized, completely hollow. Their praise wasn't an expression of love. It was a form of payment, a cheap currency they used to keep me compliant, to keep the renovations and financial support coming. "What would we do without you, Sammy? You're our savior." The words echoed in my mind, no longer a source of pride, but a sickening confirmation of my role. A savior is a tool, a functionary. You use them to solve a problem, and when the crisis is over, their purpose is fulfilled. You might be grateful, but you don't make them the king. The king was home now, and the savior was being thanked for her service and shown the door. The hours ticked by. Darkness fell outside my window, mirroring the darkness that had consumed me. I couldn't stay in the room any longer. It felt like the walls were shrinking, pressing in on me. My throat was tight and dry. I needed a glass of water. An act so simple and mundane it felt like an anchor in the storm of my thoughts. I had to believe that a world still existed where you could get a glass of water from a tap and drink it. I opened my door and crept down the stairs, my bare feet silent on the wooden steps. I prayed they would all be in bed, that I could navigate the house like a ghost and retreat back to my room unseen. But as I reached the bottom of the staircase, I saw the dim glow of the television flickering in the living room. My father was asleep in the recliner, my recliner, the one I'd bought him for Christmas, his mouth slightly ajar, the local newscasting shifting blue shadows on his face. He looked peaceful, untroubled. The man who had detonated my life just hours earlier was sleeping soundly. I continued to the kitchen. My mother was there, standing at the sink, her back to me. She was methodically scrubbing a pot that was already clean. Her movements were small and rigid, a pantomime of domesticity. She had to have heard me, but she didn't turn around. She just kept scrubbing. "Mom?" The word was a dry rasp, barely audible. She stopped scrubbing. Her shoulders tensed. For a long, agonizing moment, she didn't move or speak. The only sound was the drip of water from the faucet into the pot she was holding. Finally, without turning to face me, she spoke to the reflection of the dark window in front of her. "It's for the best." "Samantha." Her voice was flat, emotionless. It was the voice you would use to tell a child they couldn't have another cookie. It was calm, reasonable, and utterly devoid of compassion. There was no apology in it, no sadness, no regret. It was a statement of fact, a verdict. And in that verdict, my entire existence, my feelings, my sacrifices, my future, had been weighed, considered, and dismissed as irrelevant. The coldness of it was more devastating than my father's anger. His cruelty I could almost understand as a clumsy expression of his own shame and resentment. But this quiet surgical removal of me from the family's heart, was something else entirely. This was a calculated decision, a choice made in the clear light of day. She wasn't a reluctant accomplice being dragged along by my father's decree. She was a co-conspirator. She believed in this. She had looked at her 2 children and decided to sacrifice one for the other. I didn't get my glass of water. There was nothing left for me here. I turned and walked back up the stairs, the cold truth of her words chasing me. I was an orphan. My parents were still alive, still breathing in the rooms below me, but I was utterly and completely alone. Back in my room, the glacier of grief inside me finally began to crack. The tears came, hot and silent. I cried not for the house or the money, but for the loss of my mother. I cried for the little girl who believed her mom was her fiercest protector. I cried for the young woman who thought she had earned her mother's love and respect. The betrayal wasn't just about what they were doing to me now. It was about what they had been doing to me all along. My mind, now painfully clear, started connecting the dots, tracing the pattern of this betrayal back through the years. I remembered my 16th birthday. My parents had promised to take me out for a special dinner, just the 3 of us. But that afternoon, Ryan's baseball team made it to the regional semifinals, and my special dinner was abruptly canceled in favor of a road trip to watch his game. "You understand, honey," my mother had said, already packing a cooler. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime thing for your brother." My birthday was an annual event. His victory was singular. I remembered when I'd won a significant scholarship to nursing school. I'd called home, bursting with the news. "Oh, that's wonderful," my mom had said, her voice distracted. "Listen, honey, I have to call you back. Ryan's having some trouble with his car, and your father and I are trying to figure out how to help him." His minor inconvenience had taken precedence over my major achievement. They weren't 1,000 tiny cuts as I had once thought. They were lessons. They were training sessions, conditioning me for my role. I was being taught systematically that my needs, my feelings, and my successes were secondary. I was the supporting character, the reliable bedrock upon which the real story, Ryan's story, was to be built. My purpose was to be stable, to be responsible, to be the safety net. And I had played my part perfectly, never realizing that the final act required the safety net to be cut away, having served its purpose. Lying in the dark, I finally understood. This eviction wasn't a sudden act of cruelty. It was the logical, inevitable conclusion of my entire life. The first light of dawn seeped through my linen curtains, casting pale gray stripes across the room. It was morning, a new day. For most of the world, that meant a fresh start, a continuation of life. For me, it meant the clock was now officially ticking. 36 hours left. The thought landed in my stomach like a stone, sending a fresh wave of nauseating dread through me. I hadn't slept. I had drifted in and out of a state of numb, tear-stained exhaustion, my mind replaying the events of the last 12 hours on a continuous, brutal loop. My father's cold command, my brother's smirk, my mother's back, a wall of silent, unforgiving rejection. Below me, I could hear the familiar sounds of the house waking up, the rattle of the coffee maker, the floorboards creaking as my father walked down the hall, the low murmur of the morning news. The sheer, unadulterated normality of it was a profound insult. They had shattered my world and were now calmly making toast. I felt trapped, a prisoner in my own room. The idea of facing them, of sitting at that kitchen table and pretending to have an appetite, was impossible. What could I even say? Do I beg? Do I argue? Every possible scenario ended with my humiliation. They had made their decision. I was powerless. My only task now was to manage my own demolition, to pack up the life I had built and disappear quietly, as instructed. But where would I go? All my money, my carefully constructed future, was sunk into the floorboards and the drywall and the roof of this very house. I would have to find a cheap apartment, dip into my credit cards to cover the deposit, and start over from absolute zero. The injustice of it was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest and making it hard to breathe. I needed to talk to someone who wasn't inside this toxic terrarium. I needed an outside perspective, a voice of sanity. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking so much I had to try 3 times to unlock it. I scrolled to Claire's name, my oldest friend, my rock. She was a paralegal, her mind a sharp, orderly place of facts and logic. Right now, logic was the only thing that felt safe. I locked my bedroom door, took a deep breath, and hit call. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful. "Hey, Sam! You're up early. Don't tell me you're already on your way to a shift?" The sound of her normal, happy voice broke something in me. A sob escaped my lips before I could stop it. "Claire!" I choked out. And then the story came tumbling out of me in a messy, incoherent flood of words and tears. I told her everything. The dinner, the 2-day deadline, the years of sacrifice, the money, the repairs, the cold, final words of my mother. On the other end of the line, Claire was silent, letting me pour it all out. When I finally finished, my voice a raw whisper, the silence stretched for a moment, I could hear her breathing, a slow, steady rhythm. When she spoke, her cheerful tone was gone, replaced by a low, simmering fury I knew well. It was the voice she used when she talked about profound injustice. "Sam," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "I am going to drive over there right now and burn that house to the ground." Despite myself, a watery laugh escaped me. "Please don't," I whispered. "I need a place to sleep for the next 2 nights." "Okay, fine," she conceded. "I'll wait 48 hours. But Sam, I don't even have words for this. This is monstrous." Then her tone shifted. The anger was still there, but it was now sharpened by a professional edge. The paralegal was taking over. "Okay, let's put the emotion aside for a second and just think. They can't just throw you out on the street. Even as a tenant, you have rights. They'd have to go through a formal eviction process." "I'm not a tenant, Claire," I said miserably. "I'm their daughter." "And it's their house, is it?" she asked. The question was simple, but it hung in the air between us. "Are you absolutely 100% certain of that? Think back to when you paid off the foreclosure. You said you were at the bank. You signed a mountain of paperwork. What exactly did you sign?" I tried to recall the details, but the memory was a blur of stress and exhaustion. "I don't know," I said, frustrated. "I have no idea. It was all legal stuff, deeds and titles and things. I just signed where the man told me to sign. My parents were there. I trusted them." "I know you did," Claire said softly. "But banks don't operate on trust. They operate on liability. Think about it from their perspective. A massive debt on a property has just been paid in full by a third party. You, the person with the stable job and the income, not your parents, who had just defaulted. In a situation like that, it's not uncommon for the bank to transfer the title of the property to the person who cleared the debt. They want the most responsible party's name on that document." The idea was so utterly foreign, so contrary to the entire narrative of my life, that I couldn't process it. "But they would have told me," I stammered. "My parents they wouldn't hide that from me." Claire's voice was gentle but firm. "Wouldn't they, Sam? The people who just told you to get out of the home you saved? The people who used you as their personal ATM for 3 years? I think we need to question every assumption we have about them right now." A tiny, fragile seed of something I couldn't yet name began to sprout in the barren wasteland of my despair. It wasn't hope. It was just a sliver of possibility, a crack in the solid wall of my powerlessness. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I want you to get on your laptop," she said, her voice now crisp and commanding. "Don't say a word to any of them. Go to the Oregon County Records website. Property records are public information. You can search by address. I want you to pull the current deed of trust for that house and read the name under owner. Do it right now." After we hung up, I sat on my bed, my phone still in my hand, my heart starting to pound a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs. This was insane. A wild goose chase. It was a fantasy, a desperate fiction my friend was spinning to make me feel better. My parents were cruel and selfish, yes, but a deception of this magnitude felt impossible. And yet, the seed of possibility was there. What if? With trembling hands, I reached for my laptop on my nightstand. I opened it and typed County Property Records into the search bar. The website was as clunky and outdated as I imagined. A mess of blue hyperlinks and poorly formatted text. It took me a few minutes to navigate to the right portal. Each click of the trackpad felt momentous. My breath was shallow, my palms sweating. I was about to prove Claire wrong, to confirm my own miserable fate, but I had to know. I typed our address into the search fields. 1428 Willow Creek Lane. The address was etched into my soul. I hesitated for a second before clicking the search button, my mind a swirling vortex of dread and a terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of hope. I clicked it. A loading icon spun on the screen for what felt like a full minute. My entire life seemed to hang in that digital limbo. Then, the page refreshed. A single line of text appeared with a link to a PDF deed of trust, 1428 Willow Creek Lane. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely control the cursor. I moved it over the link and clicked. The document opened in a new tab, a scanned image of an official form, filled with dense blocks of legal text. I ignored the jargon, my eyes frantically scanning the page for the one piece of information I needed. I found the section titled Grantee Owner. My heart stopped. The world tilted on its axis. Time itself seemed to bend and warp. There, in clear, unambiguous typed letters, was my name. Hayes. Samantha L.I. stared at it, my brain refusing to process the information my eyes were sending it. It had to be a mistake, a typo. I closed the document and opened it again. It was still there. I zoomed in on the name, the pixels blurring as I got closer, as if proximity could change the truth. It didn't. Samantha L. Hayes. Me. The world outside my window, the sounds of my family in the kitchen, my own body sitting on my bed. It all faded away. The only reality was the name on the screen. The story I had been telling myself for 3 years, the story of the dutiful daughter sacrificing for her parents' home, was a lie. The narrative of my own victimhood, so potent and painful just minutes before, had been obliterated. It wasn't their house. It had never been their house, not since that day at the bank. It was my house. I hadn't been paying to live under their roof. They had been living under mine. The shock was so profound, so utterly disorienting that I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I gripped the edge of my laptop, anchoring myself to this new, terrifying reality. The eviction notice, the cold dismissal, the triumphant smirk, it all took on a new, more sinister meaning. They weren't just kicking me out. They were trying to steal my house. For a long time, I didn't move. I sat on the edge of my bed, the laptop warm on my thighs, and stared at my name on the deed. Samantha L. Hayes. It was a fact, printed in stark black and white, but my mind, conditioned by a lifetime of subservience, struggled to accept it. The world had been one way for 31 years, and now, in the space of a single mouse click, it had been turned inside out. The first wave of shock began to recede, replaced by a tsunami of questions, each one more bewildering than the last. How? Why? I fumbled for the printer on my small desk, my hands still shaking, and printed the document. I needed to hold it. I needed to feel the flimsy weight of the paper in my hands to convince myself it was real. As the printer whirred and spat out the page, the truth of it began to settle in my bones. It was real. This house was mine, and with that certainty, the questions became darker. Why would they hide it? If their gratitude had been genuine, wouldn't this have been a celebration? I could almost picture the scene. My parents sitting me down, tears in their eyes, showing me the deed. You saved us, Sammy, and the bank recognized that. This house is yours now. It's the least we could do. It would have been a moment of profound love and validation, but that's not what happened. Instead, they had chosen silence. A deliberate, calculated 3-year-long silence. They had watched me treat the property as theirs, my own role as that of a grateful tenant. They had allowed me to live in a state of perpetual obligation to them, a debt I could never repay because I was the one who held all the power. The deception was so twisted, so profoundly manipulative, it was hard to comprehend. It wasn't just withholding a piece of information. They had actively curated a false reality for me to live in, a reality that kept me small, dutiful, and under their control. I started pacing the room, the printed deed clutched in my hand. The 4 walls that had felt like a prison just an hour before now felt like the outer edges of a vast and sinister conspiracy. The eviction notice wasn't just cruel anymore. It was absurd. How could they kick me out of my own house? They couldn't, not legally. So what was their plan? Were they counting on my ignorance? Did they assume I would just pack my bags and leave, never thinking to question the ownership of the home I had single-handedly saved and rebuilt? Yes, that had to be it. They were counting on me to play the part they had assigned me. The good, quiet daughter who never made a fuss. And then a colder, sharper thought pierced through my confusion. Ryan. This was all about Ryan. They couldn't give him the house if I owned it. So what was this elaborate theater for? Were they going to forge my signature on a quitclaim deed? Were they planning to pressure me into signing it over, using emotional blackmail and my lifelong training of putting their needs before my own? The thought made me feel sick, and it led to another, even more terrifying question. If they were capable of hiding the deed for 3 years, what else were they capable of? Claire's voice echoed in my mind. Question every assumption we have about them right now. My eyes fell on my closet, my dresser, the neat piles of my belongings. Then my mind drifted to the rest of the house, to my parents' room, and I remembered something. The mail. For the last few months, since Ryan had come home, I hadn't seen a single piece of mail with my name on it. Not a credit card offer, not a piece of junk mail, not even a circular from the local grocery store. I had chalked it up to my switch to paperless billing, but that wasn't entirely true. There should have been something. A person doesn't just cease to exist in the postal system. A new kind of dread, specific and sharp, began to form. It was a violation to even think about it, a transgression against the sacred privacy of a child towards their parents. But they had already burned that temple to the ground. There were no sacred rules left. My heart pounded a heavy, guilty rhythm as I crept out of my room and down the hall to their bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and slipped inside. My breath held tight in my chest. The room smelled of them. My father's Old Spice aftershave and the faint, powdery scent of my mother's perfume. It was an intimate, familiar smell that now felt menacing. I scanned the room. My mother's vanity was cluttered with jewelry and makeup. My father's nightstand had a neat stack of books on it. It all looked so normal. Too normal. Where would they hide something? I started with my mother's desk in the corner. I rifled through the drawers, my hands clumsy with haste and fear. Old bills, dried up pens, loose photographs, nothing. I felt a pang of guilt mixed with a foolish sense of relief. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Then I saw their closet. The door was closed. I walked over and slid it open. It was packed with their clothes, the story of their lives told in fabric and fading colors. And there, on the top shelf, tucked away behind a stack of old blankets, was a shoebox. It wasn't a sentimental keepsake box. It was a plain cardboard box for a brand of shoes my dad hadn't worn in years. And it was sealed shut with a strip of yellowing packing tape. My blood went cold. That was it. I dragged the desk chair over, my movements stiff with adrenaline. I climbed up, my hands trembling as I reached for the box and pulled it down. It was heavier than I expected. I sat on the floor, my back against their bed, and used my house key to slice through the tape. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent room. I lifted the lid. The box was full of letters, a thick, dense stack of them, and on the top of the pile, the first address my eyes landed on was my own, Ms. Samantha L. Hayes. I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush. I started pulling them out one by one. There were dozens. Credit card pre-approvals, alumni magazines from my college, advertisements, bank statements from an old account I'd forgotten about. They had been intercepting and hiding my mail for months. The premeditation of it was staggering, and then I saw the envelopes that didn't fit. A series of them, 6 or 7, all from a bank I'd never heard of, West Creek Financial. They were windowed envelopes, and through the transparent pane, I could see my name and address, typed out with chilling formality. My fingers felt numb as I tore open the first one. It was dated 2 months prior. It was a welcome letter. "Dear Ms. Hayes," it began. The cheerful words a stark contrast to the horror dawning on me. "On behalf of everyone at West Creek Financial, I'd like to welcome you as our newest customer. We are pleased to have approved your application for a home equity line of credit, secured against your property at 1428 Willow Creek Lane." I had never applied for such a thing. I had never even heard of West Creek Financial. I dropped the letter as if it had burned me and frantically tore open the next one. It was a statement. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers until they landed on a line item under recent activity. Date, 2 weeks after the welcome letter. Description, disbursement. Amount, $40,000. A sound escaped my throat. A choked, guttural noise of pure disbelief. $40,000. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I had to put my head between my knees to keep from fainting. The pieces of the puzzle weren't just clicking into place. They were forming a picture of such monstrous, calculated greed that it defied belief. There was one more sealed envelope from the bank, the thickest one. With a sense of final, sickening dread, I opened it. It was a full copy of the loan agreement. I flipped through the pages of dense legal text until I reached the end, the signature page. And there, scrawled clumsily on the line next to my typed name, was a forgery of my signature. It was a poor imitation, shaky and uncertain, but it was meant to be mine. I fell back against the bed, the papers fluttering to the floor around me. The last vestiges of my grief, my sadness, my confusion were incinerated in a flash of pure, white-hot rage. This was the plan. This was the endgame. It was all so horrifically clear. They had used my name, my identity, and the equity I had built in my own home to secure a massive loan. They had the $40,000. And their next step was to kick me out of the house, leaving me homeless and legally responsible for a debt that would financially cripple me for the rest of my life. The money, no doubt, was for Ryan. It was his seed money for his next failed venture, his fresh start, bought and paid for with the complete and utter destruction of my future. They hadn't just betrayed me. They hadn't just used me. They had set a trap. They had lined it with my love and my trust and my sense of duty, and they had patiently waited for me to walk into it. The people who had brought me into this world had systematically plotted my ruin. As I sat on the floor of their bedroom, surrounded by the undeniable proof of their crime, the victim inside me died, and something much colder, much harder, and much more dangerous took her place. The rage that had ignited in my parents' closet didn't burn out. It cooled, hardening into something dense and powerful, a core of polished steel where my fragile heart used to be. The tears were gone. The shock was gone. All that remained was a chilling, absolute clarity. I knew exactly what I had to do. I spent the next hour in my room, not with panic, but with a methodical, almost clinical precision. I went online and made 3 copies of the house deed. I made 3 copies of every page of the fraudulent loan agreement. I made 3 copies of the bank statement showing the $40,000 disbursement. The hum of my small printer was the only sound in the room, a quiet machine manufacturing the ammunition I would need for the coming war. I organized the originals into a manila folder, which I tucked safely into my overnight bag. The copies I arranged into 3 neat packets on my desk. Then, I got ready. I didn't put on my nurse's scrubs, the uniform of a caregiver. I chose my clothes like a warrior choosing armor. A pair of dark-fitted jeans, a simple black high-necked sweater. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe ponytail. I looked at myself in the mirror. The face that stared back was mine, but the look in my eyes was foreign. The softness was gone, replaced by a cold, steady resolve. There was no trace of the weeping girl from the night before. I was no longer their daughter. I was their consequence. With my handbag containing 1 set of the damning copies, I walked out of my room and down the stairs. It felt, as it had the night before, like a long, slow descent, but this time I was not a victim retreating from a wound. I was a general walking onto a battlefield of my own choosing. The scene in the kitchen was a twisted parody of a happy family breakfast. My mother was at the stove, humming along to a song on the radio while she flipped pancakes. The sweet, buttery smell filled the air, a scent that had once meant comfort and now felt like a nauseating lie. Ryan was at the table, slouched over his phone, already shoveling a pancake into his mouth. My father sat opposite him, hiding behind the business section of the newspaper, a mug of coffee steaming at his elbow. They were a perfect portrait of denial, carrying on with the mundane rituals of a life they had stolen. I walked into the room, and the atmosphere shifted. My presence was a discordant note in their carefully composed harmony. Ryan glanced up from his phone, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. My mother turned from the stove, her cheerful humming faltering when she saw my face. My father rustled his newspaper, a subtle acknowledgement that the ghost at the feast had arrived. I didn't sit down. I walked to the counter, poured myself a mug of black coffee, and stood there, leaning against the cold granite. I took a slow sip, the bitter liquid a welcome shock to my system. I let the silence stretch, letting my quiet, unmoving presence disrupt their morning. I wanted them to feel my gaze. I wanted them to know that the rules of their game had changed. It was my father who broke first. He lowered his newspaper with a sigh of theatrical impatience, the sound cracking the silence. He didn't look at me. He addressed the coffee pot, his voice laced with the same casual cruelty as the night before. "The clock's ticking, Samantha. I hope you've started packing. Don't expect your mother to do it for you." That was the signal. That was the opening I had been waiting for. I pushed off from the counter and walked to the table. I moved with a calm that felt utterly alien to me, an out-of-body experience. I was watching myself perform these actions from a great, protected distance. I reached into my handbag and pulled out the first document, the copy of the house deed. I placed it on the table in the empty space between the syrup bottle and the butter dish, directly in my father's line of sight. I smoothed it out with my palm, the sound of the paper sliding across the wood a soft, deliberate hiss. 2 days? I asked, my voice as calm and level as a frozen lake. "No, that timeline doesn't work for me," Ryan scoffed, finally looking up from his phone. "What's this? Your lease agreement? Hate to break it to you, sis, but it's been terminated." He smirked at his own joke. "This," I said, my eyes locked on my father, "is the legally registered deed for this property, the official copy from the county records office. And if you look right here," I tapped a neatly manicured finger on the owner's name, "you'll see that the owner is Samantha L. Hayes. This is my house." The change in the room was instantaneous. Ryan's smirk vanished. My mother, who had been approaching the table with a plate of pancakes, froze mid-stride, the plate hovering in her hands. My father snatched the paper from the table, his eyes scanning it, his confident facade beginning to crack. His face, ruddy and self-assured just moments before, was rapidly losing its color. "This is ridiculous," he blustered, throwing the paper down. "It's a mistake. Some kind of clerical error." "There is no error," I said, my voice unwavering. "The title was transferred to my name 3 years ago when I paid off the foreclosure debt. You were both there. You saw the documents. You've known this entire time." "That's not true," my mother cried, finally finding her voice. It was thin and reedy. "We would never—" "Wouldn't you?" I interrupted, turning my cold gaze on her. She flinched, taking a step back. Ryan, ever the golden boy, tried to regain control. He laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Okay, very funny, Sam. You made a fake document on your computer to try and scare us. Cute, but the joke's over." "You're right," I said, reaching into my bag again. "The joke is over." I pulled out the next set of papers, the loan agreement from West Creek Financial. I laid them on the table next to the deed, fanning them out so the title page, the disbursement statement, and the forged signature were all visible. "Let's talk about something that isn't a joke," I said, my voice dropping an octave, each word a carefully placed stone. "Let's talk about a $40,000 line of credit, taken out against my property. Let's talk about identity theft. Let's talk about this signature, right here." The forgery that one of you committed when you committed a felony in my name. This time, the silence was absolute. It was the dead, airless silence of a tomb. The last vestiges of color drained from my parents' faces. My mother looked as though she was going to collapse, her hand flying to her chest. Ryan stared at the papers, his jaw slack, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The money was for him. The crime was for him. He was caught. My father looked at the documents, then at me. The arrogance, the anger, the bluster, it was all gone. In its place was the hollow, terrified look of a trapped animal. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. So, no, I continued, my voice the only sound in the suffocating stillness of the room. I will not be packing my things. I will not be leaving in 2 days. I will not be leaving at all. But I would strongly suggest that you three figure out your next steps. Because this, I tapped the loan documents again, is a crime, and I have the evidence. And I am no longer the quiet, dutiful daughter you can push around. I let the words hang in the air, a final, undeniable declaration of my own emancipation. I watched their little kingdom of lies and entitlement crumble into dust before my very eyes. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to cry. My power was in the truth, and the truth was irrefutable. I calmly picked up my mug, took one last sip of the cold coffee, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them to drown in the wreckage they had made. The silence that followed my declaration in the kitchen was a physical entity. It was a thick, heavy blanket of guilt and shock that smothered the air, making it hard to breathe. I saw the three of them not as family, but as defendants in a courtroom where I was the sole judge and jury, and the verdict had just been rendered. They were guilty. There was nothing left to say. I turned my back on them, the image of their shattered faces seared into my mind, and walked upstairs. I didn't run. I walked with the same deliberate, unhurried pace I had used on my way down. Each step was a confirmation of my own power. In my room, I closed the door and locked it. Not out of fear, but to create a sterile, protected space where I could execute the next phase of my plan. The emotional confrontation was over. The logistical reclamation was about to begin. My first call was to Claire. I sat on the edge of my bed, my voice as steady as it had been at the breakfast table. I recounted the scene, giving her a clipped, factual summary of the confrontation. I showed them the deed, I said. Then I showed them the loan documents. There was a moment of silence on her end, and then she let out a long, slow whistle. Sam, you're my hero. How are you holding up, really? I'm fine, I said, and the strange thing was, I meant it. The storm had passed, and I was in the calm, quiet eye. But now I need to lock everything down. What's my first move? Claire, ever the professional, shifted immediately into paralegal mode. Okay, first the bank. Call the official fraud hotline for West Creek Financial. Do not talk to anyone at a local branch. You need to get this into the hands of their corporate security team immediately. Use the words identity theft, forgery, and fraudulent loan. Tell them you have a copy of the deed proving ownership and that you are filing a police report. They will take that very seriously. Okay, I said, grabbing a notepad. Second, she continued, while you're doing that, I'll email you the links to the 3 credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. You need to go to each site and place a fraud alert and a credit freeze on your file. It's a bit of a pain, but it's critical. It will make it impossible for anyone to open any new lines of credit in your name. Got it, I said, my pen flying across the page. Third, she paused. What do you want to do about them? I want them out of my house, I said, the words tasting clean and simple. Legally, that will require an eviction notice, she started. I have a faster way, I interrupted. I'm not just getting them out. I'm taking back everything that's mine. After I hung up with Claire, I began the calls. The conversation with the bank's fraud department was chillingly impersonal. I was assigned a case number and spoke to a man named David, who had the weary, dispassionate tone of someone who dealt with the wreckage of people's lives every day. I laid out the facts, my voice never wavering. He listened, asked a few clarifying questions, and instructed me to email all my documentation to a secure address. An official investigation, he assured me, would begin immediately. Next, I navigated the bureaucratic websites of the credit bureaus, freezing my financial identity with a series of clicks. With each confirmation email that popped into my inbox, I felt a layer of armor sliding into place around me. They could not touch me anymore. They could not use me anymore. The final call I made was to a local moving company. Johnson & Sons Moving, a cheerful voice answered. Hello, I said, my tone all business. I need to book a move for today if possible. I have a number of large furniture items and appliances that need to be moved from a house into a storage unit. Today is a bit last minute, the woman said, but let me see. We might have a crew finishing up a job early. Can you give me the address? I gave her the address of my own home. They could have a truck and 2 men here in 2 hours. Perfect. I spent the next 2 hours packing my personal belongings. I worked with a detached efficiency, folding my clothes into boxes, wrapping my books in newspaper. I felt like I was packing up the life of a stranger. This room, this girl who had lived in it, was not me anymore. Exactly 2 hours later, a large, bright blue moving truck rumbled up the driveway. I was watching from my window and went down to meet them before they even had a chance to ring the bell. The doorbell, I remembered with a pang of bitter irony, was one of the first things I had fixed when I moved back in. The 2 movers were polite, strong-looking men in company polo shirts. I walked them to the front door, and as I opened it, I saw my family huddled in the living room. They were sitting amidst the ghosts of their morning routine, the dirty breakfast plates still on the dining table, the newspaper scattered on the floor. They looked stunned, adrift, as if they were waiting for instructions on how to proceed with their lives now that the script had been torn up. They all looked up as we entered, their faces a mixture of confusion and dread. "Ma'am?" the lead mover asked, looking from me to them. "Where would you like us to start?" I took a deep breath. "We'll start here," I said, my voice echoing in the tense silence of the living room. I pointed to the large, comfortable sofa I had spent a month's overtime pay on. This sofa, and the matching armchair, the coffee table, that television, and the recliner in the corner. My father shot to his feet. "Wait a minute," he stammered, his voice weak. "You can't just—" I turned to face him, my expression utterly blank. I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, my eyes holding his, letting him see the cold, hard stranger I had become. I saw the fight in him die, replaced by a wave of defeated resignation. He sank back into his chair, a man utterly broken in a house he didn't own. He didn't speak again. The movers, sensing the tension but professionally ignoring it, got to work. They efficiently wrapped the sofa in blankets and maneuvered it out the door. With each item that was removed, the room felt larger, emptier, sadder. The soul of the house was being systematically extracted. We moved through the rooms, a slow, methodical procession of reclamation. In the dining room, I pointed to the oak table and the 6 matching chairs. "These 2, I said, "and the chandelier." My mother let out a small, wounded sob from the kitchen doorway. I didn't look at her. I would not allow her performance of grief to affect me. In the kitchen, I directed them to the stainless steel refrigerator. "It's full," my mother whispered, her voice trembling. "Then you should probably empty it," I said, my voice flat. She and Ryan scrambled to pull out milk cartons, vegetables, and containers of leftovers, all groceries I had purchased, piling them in a pathetic heap on the bare counter. We took the washing machine and dryer from the laundry room. We took the lawnmower from the garage. We went upstairs. I directed them to the guest room where Ryan had been sleeping. This bed frame, the mattress, and that dresser. Ryan just stood in the hallway, his arms crossed, his face a mask of sullen, impotent rage. The golden boy had been dethroned and was now watching as his kingdom was dismantled. The process took nearly 3 hours. By the end, the house was a hollow, echoing shell. It was stripped of every comfort, every convenience I had provided. All that remained was the old, worn furniture from before my intervention, a few pathetic islands in a vast sea of empty space. The house was no longer a home. It was just a building, and it looked as broken and defeated as the 3 people standing lost within it. When the movers had loaded the last item onto the truck, I paid them, adding a generous tip for their efficiency and discretion. I did a final walkthrough of the gutted rooms. It was done. I walked to the kitchen, took a pen from my bag, and tore a sheet from a notepad. I wrote a single simple sentence. I left the note on the barren kitchen counter, a final stark message in the wreckage. It said, "You gave me 2 days. I only needed 1. I walked out the front door into the bright afternoon sun. I didn't look back. I got into my car, the engine turning over with a reassuring roar, and pulled out of the driveway, leaving the house and the 3 ghosts trapped inside it behind me forever. The first few nights of my new life were spent on an air mattress in Claire's spare bedroom. The unfamiliar silence of her apartment, the strange shapes of the shadows on the walls, the feeling of being utterly untethered from everything I had ever known. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it was intoxicating. It was the profound, lung-expanding silence of freedom. For the first time in my adult life, no one needed anything from me. There were no hidden tensions to navigate, no impending crises to brace for, no emotional voids to fill. There was just me. The quiet was a blank canvas, and for the first time, I was the only one holding the brush. The days that followed were a flurry of administrative tasks that felt like sacred rituals of severance. Claire guided me through the legal maze with a calm, reassuring hand. On her advice, I filed an official police report for the identity theft and fraud. I didn't do it out of a thirst for vengeance. I didn't imagine my parents being led away in handcuffs. I did it to create a firewall. It was an official, irrefutable record of their crime, a legal document that would protect me from any future claims or attempts to entangle me in their lives. The case moved through the system with a slow, impersonal grind. I heard months later that the charges had been pleaded down. My parents received a probationary sentence and a hefty fine, their age and clean records sparing them from jail time. It made no difference to me. My victory wasn't in their punishment, but in my own liberation. The bank's internal investigation was swift and decisive. Armed with my documentation, they nullified the fraudulent loan and cleared my name of any associated debt. They sent me a series of dry, formal letters of apology, but the real apology was the restoration of my financial integrity. The biggest question was the house. The property at 1428 Willow Creek Lane. My house. The idea of selling it was tempting. A clean break, a large sum of money to start over, but the thought of my parents being forced to leave felt complicated. The idea of living there myself was impossible. The memories were tainted, the very walls saturated with betrayal. Claire, ever practical, offered a third option. "It's an asset, Sam," she'd said over coffee one morning. "Don't let them turn your greatest asset into your greatest trauma. Make it work for you." And so, a month after I had walked out, I returned. I hired a locksmith and stood on the porch, my heart a steady, even rhythm as he replaced the locks. When he was done, he handed me a new set of keys. They felt solid and real in my hand. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was as I had left it, empty, echoing, and sad. It smelled of dust and stale air, but it no longer felt like a place of ghosts. It just felt like a building, a blank slate. I hired a property management company, a professional buffer between me and the property's past. They were efficient and unsentimental. They listed the house for rent, and within 2 weeks they had found the perfect tenants. A young doctor and his wife, a teacher, with a toddler and another baby on the way. I met them briefly to sign the final papers. They were so full of hope and excitement, talking about which room would be the nursery and where they would plant a vegetable garden in the spring. Seeing their bright, happy future about to unfold in that space was a strange and unexpected form of healing. The house wouldn't be a monument to my pain. It would be a home again, just not for me. The rent checks that started arriving each month were a quiet, steady reminder of my own independence. The asset they had tried to steal from me was now funding my new life. I rarely heard news of my family, and I never sought it out. But small towns have long memories and even longer tongues. I heard through a cousin, in a hushed, sympathetic phone call, that Ryan was working at a home improvement store stocking shelves. His grand entrepreneurial dreams had dissolved into the reality of an hourly wage. My parents had become recluses. They sold their car and were rarely seen outside the gutted house they no longer owned. The shame of what they had done, now public knowledge, was a prison of their own making. One day, a single letter, forwarded from the hospital, arrived at my new apartment. The handwriting on the envelope was my mother's. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but curiosity won. I slid it open and read the 2 pages inside. It was not an apology. It was a long, rambling tapestry of excuses and justifications. She wrote of their financial desperation, of their deep, abiding love for my brother and their belief in his potential. She wrote that they had always seen me as the strong one, the one who could handle anything, the one who would always land on her feet. It was a final, pathetic attempt to reframe their cruelty as a backhanded compliment. I read the letter, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not even a flicker of the old familiar sense of obligation. The words were meaningless, the justifications of a stranger. I calmly tore the letter into 4 neat squares and dropped them into the recycling bin. She had no power over me anymore. With the income from the rental house supplementing my nursing salary, I was financially stable for the first time in years. I found a beautiful 1-bedroom apartment downtown, with huge windows that flooded the space with light. I filled it slowly, not with things I needed to patch up a broken home, but with things I loved. A comfortable reading chair, a piece of art from a local painter, plants that thrived in the afternoon sun. I started saying yes. Yes to dinner with the friends I had neglected for so long. Yes to a weekend trip to the coast, where I walked on the beach and let the salt spray wash over me. Yes to joining a book club, to trying a new yoga class, to simply sitting in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning with no agenda other than to enjoy my own company. The peace I found wasn't a dramatic, cinematic revelation. It was a quiet, creeping thing. It was the absence of dread in the morning. It was the simple pleasure of buying a coffee without calculating its impact on a looming utility bill. It was the profound relief of knowing that my life was entirely my own, its successes and failures belonging to me and me alone. I had spent years trying to save my family, but the truth was, I could never have saved them. They had to save themselves. The only person I could ever truly save was me, and I had. They thought I was the quiet one, the one who would break, the one who would pack her bags and leave with her head down. They thought their betrayal would be the end of my story. Instead, it was the beginning. I didn't just walk away. I took back what was mine, legally and spiritually. And in doing so, I finally learned that peace isn't about forgiving those who hurt you. It's about protecting yourself so fiercely that they can't hurt you anymore, even if those people are your own family. My story is about a house, but it's really about self-worth. It's about realizing that you are not an endless resource for others to drain. You are a home unto yourself, and you deserve to be protected. If you've ever been betrayed by family, if you've ever felt like your sacrifices were invisible, drop your story in the comments. You are not alone. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because more stories like this are coming.